Hi everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to guide you into a world of relaxation tonight. If this video helps you unwind and fall asleep, don't forget to like and subscribe, it means so much to me. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, find a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The chill seeped through the car's windows, despite the heater blasting at full force. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his tired eyes fixed on the endless road ahead. Tonight, he was making his way home after a long business trip to a small, unfamiliar town. The lonely stretch of road cut through desolate countryside, with nothing to light the way except the twin beams of his headlights. Darkness wrapped itself around the car like a suffocating blanket. The light from the headlights illuminated the cracked asphalt ahead, casting long, grotesque shadows from the overgrown trees lining the road. Their gnarled branches stretched toward the sky like skeletal hands, swaying in the cold wind. Leaves rustled in the breeze, creating faint whispers that prickled at Jack's nerves. Every so often, the tires hit a shallow puddle left behind by the earlier rain, and the rhythmic thumping of the car broke the oppressive silence. Jack adjusted his rearview mirror, glancing into the black void behind him. He wasn't sure why he did it. No one was out here. No one should be out here. He tried to focus on the road, but the monotony of the drive began to wear him down. The hum of the engine became hypnotic, and his eyelids grew heavier with each passing mile. The radio station had long since faded into static, leaving only the low drone of the car as his companion. Jack yawned, shaking his head in an attempt to stay alert. "Just a few more hours," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding oddly loud in the empty car. He reached for his coffee cup in the holder, only to realize it was empty. He groaned. It was going to be a long night. The road seemed endless, stretching on in a straight line without any signs of civilization. No streetlights, no houses, not even a passing car. The isolation was unnerving. Jack was used to city life, where the streets were always buzzing, even at night. Here, there was nothing but the hum of his engine and the eerie whispers of the wind. Then, it happened. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting shadow at the edge of his vision. Jack brushed it off, convincing himself it was just the swaying trees. But then he saw it again. This time, it was more distinct, a figure standing just beyond the reach of his headlights. His breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively slowed the car, leaning forward to get a better look. The figure was gone. Jack shook his head, chuckling nervously. "You're just tired," he told himself, trying to ignore the tight knot forming in his stomach. He pressed his foot on the gas, speeding up slightly to shake off the unease. But the feeling didn't go away. The road began to feel smaller, the walls of darkness pressing in closer. Jack couldn't help but glance into the rearview mirror again. The inky blackness behind him was suffocating, as though something was lurking just beyond his sight. He turned his gaze back to the road, but his heart was pounding now. A sudden thud jolted the car, and Jack slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as the car skidded to a stop. His pulse was racing as he gripped the steering wheel, staring wide-eyed into the darkness ahead. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice shaky. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether to step out and check. But the idea of leaving the safety of his car sent a shiver down his spine. Slowly, he rolled the car forward, his headlights sweeping over the road. There was nothing. No sign of an animal or debris that could have caused the noise. Jack's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel tighter. Maybe he'd hit a pothole, or maybe he hadn't. Taking a deep breath, he tried to steady himself. "It's fine," he whispered. "Just keep driving." But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching him, waiting. Jack's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. The oppressive darkness seemed to press harder against the thin walls of his car, as if it were alive, suffocating, and deliberate. His headlights sliced through the black void, illuminating nothing but the endless asphalt and the looming silhouettes of trees. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow too large to belong to any animal, darting across the road far ahead. Jack blinked, his breath catching in his throat. Was he imagining it? He slowed the car, his heart thumping in his chest like a drumbeat. The shadow returned, lingering this time, standing just at the edge of the headlight's reach. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human either, not exactly. Jack's breath hitched as his eyes locked on a pair of glowing orbs hanging in the darkness like twin lanterns. They weren't headlights from another car. They weren't the reflection of an animal's eyes. These glowed unnaturally, cold and unblinking. "What the hell?" Jack whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. He eased his foot onto the brake, the car coming to a slow, reluctant stop. The figure didn't move. Jack squinted, trying to make out its shape. The glow of the eyes was hypnotic, almost drawing him in, but the rest of the figure was shrouded in shadows. It was tall, unnervingly so, and impossibly thin, as though it had been stretched beyond its natural limits. Its head tilted slightly, and for a fleeting moment, Jack swore it was looking straight at him. A chill crawled up his spine, each vertebra tingling as if ice water had been poured down his back. He couldn't explain it, but something about the figure felt wrong. His rational mind tried to come up with an explanation. A stray animal, a trick of the light, his own exhaustion playing tricks on him. But the fear clenching his chest told him otherwise. "Okay, just stay calm," he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He considered driving around it, but what if it moved? What if it wasn't something he could just ignore? Against his better judgment, Jack put the car in park and turned on the hazard lights. His fingers hovered over the door handle, hesitating. Everything inside him screamed not to get out. But curiosity, or perhaps stubbornness, got the better of him. The cold hit him like a slap the moment he stepped outside. He pulled his jacket tighter around himself, his boots crunching against the damp pavement as he cautiously approached the front of the car. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the figure was gone. Jack froze, his breath forming visible puffs in the icy air. He scanned the area, his eyes darting from the trees to the road and back again. The glowing eyes had vanished, swallowed by the night. "It's just your imagination," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. He turned back toward the car, his unease growing with each step. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he had the distinct sensation that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, and that's when he saw it. The figure was closer now, standing just a few feet from where it had been before. The glowing eyes bore into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Jack stumbled back, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it echo in his ears. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. It sounded pathetic, even to him. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It simply stood there, unnaturally still, its eyes fixed on him. Jack didn't wait to find out more. He bolted back to the car, fumbling with the door handle as panic surged through him. Once inside, he locked the doors, his shaking hands barely able to grip the keys as he turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car lurched forward. The figure disappeared in the rearview mirror, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching him. The glowing eyes were burned into his mind, an image he couldn't escape no matter how far he drove. He kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see it again. Each time, there was nothing but the black void of the road behind him. But the dread didn't leave. The further he drove, the more he felt it, an invisible weight pressing down on him, a suffocating certainty that something was following him. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but Jack's eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his breath shallow and rapid. The glowing eyes haunted him, even though they were no longer visible. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every rustle of the wind felt like an ominous whisper. Suddenly, the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Jack muttered, his voice trembling as the car began to slow. The headlights flickered, casting the trees around him into chaotic bursts of light and shadow. Panic surged through him as the car rolled to a stop in the middle of the empty road. He turned the key in the ignition, but the engine only coughed in protest. "Come on," he begged, twisting the key again and again. The sound of the failing engine filled the car, drowning out the pounding of his heart. Then, in the rearview mirror, He saw it. The figure was back, standing in the distance, perfectly still. Its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness, unblinking and unrelenting. Jack froze, his hand still on the key. He felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a predator, paralyzed by fear. And then it moved. Not like a person, not like anything natural. It didn't walk or run, it glided, its movements smooth and unnatural, as if it weren't bound by the laws of the physical world. Jack's breath hitched, and he turned in his seat, his eyes wide with terror. The figure was closer now, still shrouded in shadow, but its eyes were brighter, more menacing. "Start, damn it!" Jack shouted, slamming his fist on the dashboard. He twisted the key again, and the engine roared to life for a brief, glorious moment before sputtering out once more. The figure was closer still, now standing at the edge of the car's headlights. Jack could see it more clearly now. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were elongated, almost spider-like. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a void, an emptiness that made Jack's stomach churn. Only the eyes glowed, cold and cruel, as they locked onto him. He scrambled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the screen. There was no signal. Of course there wasn't. He was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but darkness and this thing. The figure took another step closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring his fear. Jack's mind raced. He couldn't stay in the car, he was a sitting duck. But getting out meant facing that thing. He was trapped. "Think, Jack, think," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached for the glove compartment, fumbling for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a small flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The figure was at the edge of the car now, its glowing eyes peering through the windshield. Jack could feel its gaze boring into him, heavy and suffocating. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened as the pressure mounted, a crushing weight of terror that threatened to consume him. With a burst of adrenaline, Jack threw open the car door and bolted into the night. The flashlight shook in his hand as he ran, its weak beam cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed around him, their branches clawing at him like desperate hands. Behind him, he heard it. The sound wasn't footsteps, it was something else, a low, guttural noise that sent chills down his spine. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. He just kept running, his lungs burning and his legs aching. The beam of the flashlight caught something ahead, a clearing, a faint glimmer of hope in the oppressive darkness. Jack sprinted toward it, his heart pounding in his ears. But as he reached the edge of the clearing, he froze. The figure was there, waiting for him. It moved impossibly fast, cutting off his escape. Its glowing eyes were the only source of light now, illuminating the sinister curve of its elongated limbs. Jack stumbled backward, his legs giving out as he fell to the ground. "Stay away!" he screamed, holding up the flashlight as if it could ward off the creature. The figure paused, tilting its head as if curious. For a moment, Jack thought it might retreat, but then it lunged. Jack closed his eyes, bracing for the impact, but it never came. When he opened them again, the figure was gone. The night was still and silent, as if nothing had happened. But the oppressive feeling of being watched remained, lingering like a shadow in the corners of his mind. The car's headlights flickered back to life in the distance, their weak glow cutting through the darkness. Jack scrambled to his feet and ran back to the car, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He didn't question how the lights had come back on, he didn't care. All that mattered was getting out of there. He slid into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he turned the key. This time, the engine roared to life without hesitation. Jack didn't wait. He floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as he sped down the road. But even as the car gained speed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The glowing eyes were gone, but their presence lingered, etched into his mind like a scar. And as the road stretched on before him, Jack knew one thing for certain. He would never drive this way again. The yellow lines of the road blurred under Jack's tear-filled eyes as he sped through the suffocating darkness. The car hummed like a lifeline, its vibrations grounding him as his mind raced. The figure was gone, or at least, he told himself it was. The glowing eyes, the unnatural movements, the suffocating dread. They were all behind him now. Yet, no matter how far he drove, the fear lingered, clinging to him like a second skin. He glanced into the rearview mirror again, his breath catching in his throat. There was nothing but the empty road stretching endlessly into the void. Yet, his chest tightened, a familiar pressure building as though unseen eyes were watching him. Jack forced his gaze back to the road ahead, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. "Get a grip," he muttered under his breath. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The headlights illuminated a sign in the distance. Pine Hollow 20 miles. Civilization. Safety. The thought of reaching another human being was like a beacon of hope in the oppressive night. The car's dashboard clock blinked 2:47 a.m., the numbers glowing faintly in the dim interior. Jack couldn't believe it had only been an hour since he'd left the isolated stretch of woods. It felt like days, weeks, even since he'd seen that thing. Every bump in the road, every rustle of the wind against the car sent fresh waves of paranoia coursing through him. Even when the lights of Pine Hollow appeared in the distance, Jack couldn't relax. He reached the edge of the small town, his car slowing as he passed darkened storefronts and shuttered houses. The quiet was unnerving, the streets eerily empty as if the town itself was holding its breath. He pulled into the first gas station he saw, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the still air. Jack parked the car under the harsh fluorescent lights, his hands trembling as he cut the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, he just sat there, gripping the steering wheel as he tried to calm his racing thoughts. He couldn't stay in the car, not anymore. He needed to feel the ground beneath his feet, to remind himself that he was safe. He stepped out, the cold air biting against his skin. The gas station was deserted, the windows dark, but Jack didn't care. He leaned against the car, breathing deeply, his eyes scanning the empty lot. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something moved in the corner of his vision. Jack whipped around, his eyes darting to the edge of the lot where the fluorescent lights faded into shadow. There was nothing there, just the outlines of a few trash bins and the faint glow of a street lamp in the distance. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away, but the unease gnawed at him. He reached into his pocket for his phone, the familiar weight grounding him as he opened the screen. A single bar of signal. Relief washed over him as he tapped on his wife's contact, his finger hovering over the call button. But then he stopped. What was he going to say? That he'd seen something impossible? That he was losing his mind? The words felt ridiculous even as they formed in his head. The phone slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the pavement. Jack cursed under his breath, crouching to pick it up. That's when he saw it, his shadow, stretching long and distorted under the harsh gas station lights. And behind it, another shadow, larger and taller, standing impossibly close. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes wide as he stared at the ground. The second shadow didn't move, didn't shift or waver like a trick of the light. Slowly, he turned his head, dread coiling in his stomach like a snake. There was nothing there. Jack staggered to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest as he scanned the lot again. It was empty, completely and utterly empty, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming, pressing against him like an invisible weight. He fumbled with the car door, throwing himself back into the driver's seat and locking the doors. He sat there, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. His phone vibrated in his lap, startling him. The screen lit up with a notification. No service. Jack stared at it, his mind racing. He had seen the bar of signal earlier. He was sure of it. The oppressive silence inside the car was unbearable. Jack turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. The familiar sound was a small comfort, but it did little to ease the fear clawing at his mind. He pulled out of the gas station and back onto the road, his hands gripping the wheel like a lifeline. The town disappeared behind him as he drove toward the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. The road was empty, the darkness slowly giving way to the pale light of morning. But the feeling didn't leave. It followed him, an invisible presence just out of reach. When Jack finally pulled into his driveway, the first rays of sunlight breaking over the horizon, He sat in the car for a long time. The house was still, its familiar shape offering no comfort. He didn't want to go inside. He didn't want to face the silence that awaited him. As he stepped out of the car, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The street was empty, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the shadows just beyond his sight, the glowing eyes were still watching. And they always would be. The moving truck rattled down the uneven road, its tires crunching against the gravel as Emma watched the unfamiliar neighborhood roll past through the window. It wasn't exactly what she'd envisioned when she and her husband, Mark, decided to leave the city behind for a quieter life. The houses were spaced far apart, some hidden behind overgrown hedges or leaning fences, giving the area an air of isolation. But it was affordable, and after years of cramped apartments, Emma couldn't deny the appeal of a house they could call their own. As they pulled into the driveway of their new home, Emma's first impression was bittersweet. The house itself was charming in a rustic way, with a white picket fence that desperately needed a fresh coat of paint and a front porch that sagged just enough to hint at its age. The yard was vast, bordered by towering oaks whose branches swayed lazily in the breeze. But it wasn't her new house that drew her attention, it was the one next door. The house stood at the end of the street, surrounded by an overgrown lawn where wildflowers and weeds competed for dominance. Its windows were dark, the curtains inside pulled tight as though they hadn't been touched in decades. The paint was peeling from the siding, exposing weathered wood beneath, and the roof sagged ominously under years of neglect. A rusted mailbox leaned precariously by the curb, its faded lettering too worn to read. "Is someone living there?" Emma asked, her voice low as she stepped out of the truck. Mark glanced at the house and shrugged. "Doubt it. Looks abandoned. Creepy, though." He grabbed a box from the truck bed and started toward their new home, clearly unbothered. Emma lingered for a moment, her gaze fixed on the darkened windows. There was something unsettling about the house. It felt wrong. It wasn't just the disrepair or the way it seemed to loom over its neglected yard. It was the silence. Even as the wind rustled the leaves and birds chirped in the distance, the area around the abandoned house was unnaturally still, as if the very air refused to move near it. Shaking off her unease, Emma turned her attention back to their own house. The day passed quickly as she and Mark unloaded boxes, scrubbed the kitchen counters, and started settling in. By nightfall, Emma was too exhausted to think about anything but sleep, but as she climbed into bed, her thoughts drifted back to the house next door. It wasn't until the following morning that she noticed the neighbors seemed to avoid the house entirely. When Emma stepped outside to fetch the mail, she saw a woman walking her dog on the opposite side of the street. The dog, a friendly-looking golden retriever, pulled at its leash as though trying to cross, but the woman held it back with a firm tug, casting a wary glance at the abandoned house as she hurried past. Later, Emma asked Mark if he'd seen anyone coming or going from the house. He hadn't. In fact, he hadn't thought about it at all. "It's just an old, empty house," he said dismissively, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Probably some foreclosure no one's bothered to clean up." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. As the days went by, she found herself drawn to the house in a way she couldn't explain. She started noticing little details she hadn't seen before, the way the front door seemed to hang slightly ajar, the faint outline of footprints in the dirt path leading to the porch, the way the curtains in one window looked as though they had been disturbed. And then, on the third night, she heard it. It was faint at first, a soft, muffled sound that she might have mistaken for the wind if it hadn't been so rhythmic. She sat up in bed, straining to hear. It was coming from the direction of the abandoned house. Crying. Emma's stomach knotted as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. She crossed the room to the window, pulling the curtain aside to peer into the darkness. The house next door was barely visible under the pale glow of the moon. Its dark windows stared back at her, unblinking. The sound of crying continued, growing slightly louder, but still muffled as if coming from deep within the walls. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, nudging Mark awake. "Hear what?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Someone's crying." From the house next door, Mark groaned, rolling onto his side. "Probably just the wind. Go back to sleep." Emma frowned, but she didn't push him. Instead, she stayed by the window, her heart pounding as she strained to catch the sound again. It had stopped. The night was silent once more, save for the faint rustle of leaves outside. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't imagining things. Something or someone was in that house. It started again the very next night. Emma lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts clouded by an unease she couldn't quite shake. Mark was already asleep beside her, his soft snores filling the otherwise silent room. The clock on the nightstand blinked 2:47 a.m., its red numbers glowing faintly in the dark. She was about to roll over and force herself to sleep when she heard a soft, muffled sound drifting through the night. Crying. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was faint but unmistakable, rising and falling in quiet, rhythmic sobs. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. The noise came from the same direction as before, the abandoned house next door. It was the second night in a row. The first time, she'd convinced herself it was the wind or maybe an animal. But this was deliberate. It sounded human, a woman's voice, soft and broken, like she was trapped in some endless sorrow. Emma's fingers curled into the bedsheet as she debated waking Mark. She glanced at him, his face slack with sleep, and decided against it. He'd just brush it off again, tell her it was her imagination, but Emma knew it wasn't. Sliding out of bed, she crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The night outside was eerily still. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves rustling softly, but the abandoned house remained dark and silent. She stared at it, her eyes scanning every shadow, every darkened corner. The crying continued, faint but persistent. It sent chills down her spine, the sound so mournful, so filled with despair, that she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in trouble. But the house was empty. It had to be. No one had lived there for years at least. That's what the neighbors said. Emma pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the window. As she listened, a disturbing thought began to creep into her mind. The crying was coming at the exact same time as the night before. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m., the red numbers glowing like an omen. She shivered, backing away from the window. The crying didn't stop. It didn't grow louder or quieter. It was steady, relentless, like a recording stuck on repeat. The next morning, Emma decided to bring it up to Mark again. "Do you hear it?" she asked over breakfast, her voice tight. She was gripping her coffee mug so hard she thought it might crack. "The crying. It's not just the wind. It's happened 2 nights in a row, at the exact same time." Mark frowned, setting down his toast. "Emma, you're stressed. Moving is a big change. It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you." "It's not in my head," she snapped, harsher than she intended. "It's real. Someone's in that house, and they're crying. Every night." Mark sighed, reaching across the table to take her hand. "If it'll make you feel better, I'll take a look next time. But I'm telling you, it's probably nothing." Emma nodded, but his words didn't comfort her. That night, she stayed awake, staring at the clock as it ticked toward the dreaded hour. When 2:47 a.m. arrived, she heard it again. The crying. This time, it was clearer. She could make out the soft, shuddering breaths between sobs, the faint hitch in the voice as it broke under the weight of grief. It was so human, so raw, that Emma felt her chest tighten with empathy and fear. Who could be making that sound? And why? Unable to ignore it any longer, she decided to do something she hadn't dared to before. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen, she stepped outside into the cold night air. The world was silent except for the faint, haunting sobs drifting from the house next door. The flashlight beam wavered as her hands trembled, but she forced herself to move forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The abandoned house loomed larger as she approached, its dark windows staring back at her like empty eyes. The crying grew louder, more distinct, and Emma's stomach churned. She stopped at the edge of the property, her feet rooted to the ground. She could see the front door now, slightly ajar, its chipped paint peeling away like dead skin. The sound seemed to seep out from within, filling the air around her. "Hello?" Emma called, her voice quivering. It felt foolish, speaking into the night, but she couldn't stop herself. Is someone there? Do you need help? The crying stopped. The abrupt silence was deafening. Emma's breath hitched, and her grip tightened on the flashlight. She scanned the windows, half expecting to see a face peering out at her, but there was nothing, only darkness. She took a step back, her instinct screaming at her to leave. But as she turned to go, she heard it again. A single sob, soft and broken, drifting from the house like a ghostly echo. Emma didn't wait any longer. She ran back to her house, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her heart was pounding so hard it hurt, but at least she was safe in her brightly lit kitchen, far from whatever was lurking in that house. But even as she tried to convince herself it was over, she knew she wouldn't be able to ignore it. The crying wasn't going to stop, and the worst part was, she wasn't sure she wanted it to. Emma couldn't shake the haunting cries that echoed through the night. Sleep eluded her, and during the daylight hours, the abandoned house seemed to cast a shadow over her every thought. Determined to find answers, she decided to speak with her neighbors, hoping they might shed light on the mystery. She started with Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who lived across the street. Emma found her tending to a well-manicured garden, the vibrant flowers a stark contrast to the gloom she felt. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," Emma called out, forcing a cheerful tone. "Well, hello there, dear," Mrs. Thompson replied, wiping soil from her hands. "Settling in nicely?" "Yes, thank you. Actually, I was hoping to ask you about the house next door to us." Emma gestured toward the dilapidated structure. "Do you know anything about it?" Mrs. Thompson's smile faded. She glanced at the house and then back at Emma, her eyes wary. "That old place? It's been empty for as long as I can remember. Best to leave it be." "I thought I heard something coming from there at night," Emma pressed gently, "like someone crying." Mrs. Thompson's expression hardened. "You've got a vivid imagination, dear. That house is abandoned. No one goes in, no one comes out. My advice? Keep your curtains drawn and your doors locked." Before Emma could ask more, Mrs. Thompson turned away, her body language signaling the conversation was over. Puzzled and unsatisfied, Emma visited two more neighbors. Each reacted similarly, averting their eyes, offering vague answers, and urging her to ignore the house. One even shut the door in her face when she mentioned the crying. Frustration and curiosity gnawed at her. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma sat on her front porch, sipping a cup of tea. The abandoned house stood silent, its darkened windows reflecting the fiery hues of sunset. It seemed impossible that everyone else was content to ignore it. "Are you out here again?" Mark's voice startled her. He stepped onto the porch, rubbing his eyes. "You should come inside. It's getting cold." "I can't stop thinking about it," Emma admitted. "Something isn't right. The neighbors act like it's some taboo topic. Don't you find that strange?" Mark sighed, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I think you're overreacting. But if it bothers you that much, maybe we should check it out together." Relief washed over her. "Thank you." They agreed to investigate the next day. But that night, the crying returned louder and more desperate than before. Emma lay awake, gripping the sheets as the sobs seemed to seep through the walls. She felt a pull, an urge to go to the house immediately, but fear kept her rooted in place. Morning couldn't come fast enough. After breakfast, Emma and Mark approached the abandoned house. The overgrown path crunched under their feet as they neared the front door, which hung slightly open, as if inviting them in. "Hello?" Mark called out, pushing the door wider. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight filtering through cracked windows. The interior was a time capsule. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and old furniture lay covered in tattered sheets. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something sour and rotten. "See? No one here," Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma wasn't convinced. She moved deeper into the house, her footsteps muffled by a threadbare rug. A staircase led to the second floor, its steps warped and splintered. "Maybe we should go back," Mark suggested, glancing around uneasily. "Just a little further," Emma insisted. They climbed the stairs carefully, each step protesting under their weight. At the top, a long hallway stretched before them, lined with closed doors. The crying had always seemed to come from somewhere deep within, perhaps one of these rooms. Emma tried the first door on the left. It swung open to reveal a bedroom frozen in time, a child's room, with a small bed and toys scattered across the floor. Dust-covered dolls stared blankly from a shelf. As they moved to the next door, a floorboard creaked behind them. They spun around, but the hallway was empty. "Let's hurry," Mark whispered. Emma reached for the next doorknob, but it wouldn't turn. She pressed her ear against the door, holding her breath. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, ever so faintly, she heard it, a soft, muffled sob. "Someone's in there," she whispered excitedly. "Emma, this is crazy. We need to leave." But she was already moving, searching for a way to open the door. Spotting a rusty key hanging on a hook nearby, she snatched it up and slid it into the lock. The door clicked open. Inside was a woman, huddled in a corner. Her long, tangled hair obscured her face, and she clutched a threadbare blanket around her thin frame. The room was bare except for a cracked mirror on the wall and a small, grimy window that let in a sliver of light. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Emma asked gently, stepping into the room. The woman didn't respond. She rocked back and forth, her sobs barely audible. Mark hovered in the doorway. "We should call someone, get her help." Emma approached slowly, kneeling a few feet away. "My name is Emma. We just moved in next door. Can you tell me your name?" The woman stiffened but didn't look up. "Are you alone here? Is there someone we can call for you?" At that, the woman lifted her head slightly. Emma caught a glimpse of her face, gaunt cheeks, hollow eyes ringed with dark circles. She looked as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years. "Please," Emma pleaded, "let us help you." The woman's eyes darted toward the mirror on the wall. Emma followed her gaze. The mirror's surface was clouded with grime, but something was etched into it, a word scratched over and over. "Leave." A chill ran down Emma's spine. What does that mean? The woman finally met Emma's eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice raspy and strained. "Why not? What's happening?" "He's coming back," the woman said, her eyes wide with fear. "You have to go before he finds you." "Who? Who's coming back?" Before the woman could answer, a loud bang echoed from downstairs, the sound of a door slamming shut. Mark grabbed Emma's arm. "That's it. We're leaving." Emma hesitated, but saw the terror in the woman's eyes. "Come with us," she urged. "We can help you." The woman shook her head vehemently. "It's too late for me. Save yourselves." Another bang reverberated through the house, followed by heavy footsteps ascending the stairs. "Emma, now," Mark hissed, pulling her toward the door. Reluctantly, she allowed herself to be led away. As they hurried down the hallway, Emma glanced back to see the woman closing the door, her pale face disappearing behind it. They raced down the stairs and out the front door, not stopping until they were back inside their own house, the door locked securely behind them. "What was that?" Mark panted. Who was she talking about? Emma shook her head, her mind spinning. "I don't know, but she's in danger. We have to call the police." Mark agreed, and they dialed 911, explaining that a woman was squatting in the abandoned house and seemed to be in distress. An hour later, a patrol car arrived. The officers listened to their story with skepticism but agreed to check the house. Emma and Mark watched from their porch as the officers entered the house. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Finally, the officers emerged, shaking their heads. "There's no one in there," one of them called out. "Place is empty." "That's impossible," Emma insisted, walking up to them. "We saw her. She was real." The officer shrugged. "We searched every room. No sign of anyone." "Maybe she left," Mark suggested weakly. But Emma knew that wasn't true. The woman had been terrified, warning them to leave. Something was very wrong, and now the authorities thought they were imagining things. As the police drove away, Emma felt a sinking dread settle over her. The crying had led her to the woman, but now the mystery was deeper than ever. That night, as the clock approached 2:47 a.m., Emma sat by the window, waiting. The house next door was dark, the same as always. She held her breath, ears straining for any sound. The crying began, more anguish than before. But this time, it wasn't coming from the abandoned house. It was coming from inside her own home. The crying stopped as suddenly as it had begun. For 3 nights after Emma and Mark's harrowing encounter, the house next door remained eerily silent. The absence of sound should have been a relief, but for Emma, it was anything but. The night stretched on, heavy with unease. She stayed awake, sitting by the window, watching the abandoned house. It looked the same as always, dark, lifeless, and utterly uninviting. Yet something had shifted. The air felt different, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. The silence gnawed at her. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman, the gaunt face, the haunted eyes, the desperate warning etched in her voice. He's coming back. Save yourselves. Who was he? And where had she gone? Emma decided to check with the police again, hoping for some kind of follow-up. She and Mark visited the local station, only to be met with blank stares and dismissive responses. We didn't find anyone in the house, the officer on duty told them, and we haven't received any other reports about it. Honestly, ma'am, you're lucky you weren't hurt. That place is unstable. My advice? Stay away from it. Frustrated, Emma pushed further. But the woman, she was there. She warned us. What if she's in danger? Ma'am, the officer replied, his tone firm. If someone was there, they're gone now. We'll keep an eye on the property, but there's nothing else we can do. As they left the station, Mark put a reassuring arm around Emma. Maybe it's over, he said gently. Whoever she was, she's gone now. We need to let it go. But Emma couldn't let it go. The woman's terrified face haunted her dreams, and she often woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced she'd heard the faint sound of crying. She knew it was impossible. The crying had stopped, but the memory lingered, a phantom echo in her mind. A week passed, and life began to settle back into a semblance of normalcy. Emma busied herself unpacking boxes and decorating the house, trying to distract herself from the gnawing questions that refused to leave her alone. Mark returned to his usual routine, convinced the strange events were behind them. But Emma couldn't resist the pull of the abandoned house. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, she found herself standing at the edge of its overgrown lawn once more. The sunlight streaming through the trees did little to dispel the gloom that clung to the house like a shroud. She hesitated, her heart racing as she debated whether to step closer. She didn't know what she was hoping to find: answers, perhaps, or some trace of the woman who had vanished so completely. But the longer she stood there, the more certain she became that the house was hiding something. Something it didn't want her to see. Steeling herself, Emma approached the front door. It hung slightly ajar, just as it had the last time she entered. She pushed it open slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing through the empty halls. The house was just as she remembered it: stale, decaying, and utterly lifeless. Dust coated every surface, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, her footsteps careful and deliberate. The hallway stretched before her, lined with doors that now felt more ominous than inviting. She stopped in front of the room where she'd found the woman. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. It turned easily, and the door swung open. The room was empty. The blanket the woman had clutched was gone, as was any sign that she had ever been there. The mirror on the wall was cracked but clean. No trace of the word leave remained. It was as though the encounter had been nothing more than a dream, a figment of Emma's imagination. But Emma knew better. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of the crying woman began to fade, though it never left entirely. Emma found herself staring at the abandoned house more often than she cared to admit, her mind filled with unanswered questions. Who was the woman? Why had she been so afraid? And most troubling of all, what had happened to her? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma sat on her porch, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. The abandoned house stood in shadow, its windows dark and lifeless. She felt a pang of sadness as she gazed at it, her mind replaying the woman's desperate warning over and over. Mark joined her, sitting down beside her with a sigh. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Emma nodded. "I can't stop. I need to know who she was, why she was there." You might never get those answers, Mark said gently. Some things don't make sense, Emma, and maybe it's better that way. Emma didn't respond. She couldn't. Deep down, she knew Mark was right, but the lack of closure gnawed at her, an itch she couldn't scratch. The house next door remained silent, but its presence loomed over her, a constant reminder of the mystery she might never solve. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she thought she heard a faint sound drifting through the darkness. She sat up, straining to listen, but the house was silent. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond her reach. And though the crying had stopped, Emma knew it wasn't the end. The house held secrets, and no matter how much she tried to move on, it would never let her forget. In the quiet moments before sleep, she whispered to herself, "Who was she? And why do I feel like she's still watching me?" The answer, if it existed, was hidden within the walls of the house, waiting. The sun had barely crept over the horizon, casting the world in hues of soft orange and pink, when Sarah laced up her running shoes and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The trail stretched ahead of her, winding through dense woods that seemed to shimmer with dew in the faint light. It was her favorite time of day before the world was fully awake, when everything was quiet and still. The gravel crunched softly beneath her feet as she began her warm-up jog, the rhythmic sound a soothing companion to the morning's tranquility. She loved this trail, a hidden gem on the outskirts of town. Few people knew about it, and even fewer used it. For Sarah, it was a sanctuary, a place where she could clear her mind and escape the noise of everyday life. The trees formed a canopy overhead, their branches intertwined like fingers clasped in prayer. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden beams, dappling the ground in shifting patterns. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs weaving together in a gentle melody. As Sarah picked up her pace, the trail began to feel even more isolated. The houses and roads that marked the edge of the woods were long behind her now, replaced by the thick undergrowth and towering trees that stretched as far as the eye could see. She had run this trail countless times before, but today, the quiet felt different, heavier, almost. She shook off the thought, attributing it to her imagination. She'd barely slept the night before, her mind buzzing with work deadlines and social obligations. The trail was the same as always, calm, peaceful. If anything, the solitude was a blessing. The first mile passed uneventfully. Sarah settled into her rhythm, her breaths coming steady and controlled. The morning dew clung to her skin, cooling her as she ran. She glanced at her watch, noting her pace with satisfaction. Maybe she could push herself today, make it to the old stone bridge that marked the trail's midpoint before turning back. But as she rounded a bend, the birdsong suddenly stopped. Sarah slowed her pace, her ears straining against the sudden silence. The change was so abrupt, so jarring, that it sent a ripple of unease through her. She paused, coming to a stop in the middle of the trail. The only sound now was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Probably nothing," she muttered to herself, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. The birds always returned eventually. It was just one of those quirks of nature. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods seemed watchful, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following her. But the trail behind her was empty, stretching back into the quiet, shadowed forest. "Get a grip," she told herself, shaking her head. She started running again, her shoes crunching against the gravel in a steady rhythm. The sound was almost comforting, grounding her in the otherwise oppressive silence. But as she ran, she couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that she wasn't alone. It started as a faint tickle at the edge of her senses, a prickling awareness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She quickened her pace, her breath coming faster now, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. Then she heard it a whisper. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound had been so soft, so faint, that she wasn't even sure she'd heard it. It could have been the wind, she told herself. just the wind brushing through the leaves. But it wasn't the wind. The whisper came again, just barely audible, carried on the breeze. It was a single word, stretched and drawn out, as though the speaker were right behind her. Sarah. Her blood turned to ice. She spun around, her eyes darting through the trees, searching for the source of the voice. The trail was empty. The woods were still. Nothing moved except for the occasional flutter of leaves. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. It sounded small, swallowed up by the vastness of the forest. No response, just silence. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed away, her mind racing. It had to be her imagination. Maybe she was overtired. Maybe it was just some weird echo of her own thoughts. But deep down, she didn't believe that. She turned and started running again, faster this time, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder than she ever had before. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding like a drum. The trail ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blurring together as she raced forward. But no matter how fast she ran, the feeling of being watched didn't leave her, and the whispering didn't stop. It was faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of the wind. But as she ran, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around her, weaving through the trees, wrapping around her like invisible tendrils. "Sarah." The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it filled her with a deep, primal fear. She didn't recognize it. It wasn't a voice she knew, but somehow it knew her name. She stumbled to a stop, clutching a nearby tree for support as she struggled to catch her breath. The whispers ceased, leaving the woods eerily silent once more. Sarah turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner of the forest. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. Her words echoed back at her, mocked by the empty trail. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, just as she began to think she'd imagined it all, she saw it, a shadowy figure, barely visible through the trees. It stood far off the trail, its form indistinct, almost blending into the surrounding forest. Sarah froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. Without another thought, she turned and ran, the trail a blur beneath her feet as she sprinted back towards safety. Sarah didn't stop running until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. She slowed to a walk, gasping for breath, and glanced over her shoulder. The trail behind her was empty, just as it had been moments before. Yet the sensation of being watched hadn't faded. It clung to her, a weight pressing down on her chest. The silence was oppressive now. Even the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze felt muted, as if the woods were holding their breath. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild. The figure she'd seen, if she'd even seen it, was probably a trick of the light. And the whispers, well, maybe it had been the wind, after all. But the rational part of her mind couldn't quiet the fear twisting in her gut. Sarah adjusted her ponytail and resumed her jog, though her pace was slower now, hesitant. She told herself she'd finish the trail and go straight home. No detours, no pushing for a personal best today. Just get out of the woods and put this unsettling morning behind her. She was rounding a gentle curve in the trail when she heard it. A whisper. It was soft, barely louder than a breath, but it was unmistakable. Her name, spoken as though the speaker was standing right next to her. Sarah. She froze mid-step, her heart leaping into her throat. Her eyes darted toward the source of the sound, a cluster of bushes just off the trail. The dense undergrowth shifted slightly, as though something was moving within it. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. No response. Sarah squinted, trying to peer through the tangle of leaves and branches, but the shadows were too thick. The whisper came again, closer this time. Sarah, her name, drawn out and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was speaking wanted to savor each syllable. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It wasn't Mark's voice, nor anyone else she knew. And yet, it carried a strange intimacy, as if it had been calling her name for years. She took a cautious step closer to the bushes, her pulse hammering in her ears. "This isn't funny," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. "If you're trying to scare me, it's working." The bushes rustled again, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a shadow shift within the foliage. She backed away, her instincts screaming at her to leave, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. The air around her felt heavier now, thicker, as if the forest itself was closing in on her. "Sarah!" The whisper came again, soft and coaxing, like a lover's murmur in the dead of night. Her breath caught. She turned sharply, scanning the woods around her. The voice didn't come from the bushes this time, it came from behind her. She spun, her eyes darting to every shadow, every movement of the leaves. "Who's there?" she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. No one answered, but she could feel that something was watching her. The sensation was so strong, so overwhelming, that she couldn't shake it. It was as if the trees themselves had eyes, tracking her every move. She took a shaky step backward, her foot crunching against the gravel. The whisper came again, this time so close it could have been spoken directly into her ear. "Sarah!" She whipped around, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The trail was empty, the woods silent, but she knew she wasn't alone. Sarah didn't wait to find out more. She turned and bolted down the trail, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted through the trees. The whispering didn't stop. It followed her, weaving through the woods like an invisible thread. "Sarah! Sarah!" The voice was relentless, shifting in tone and proximity. Sometimes it was distant, carried on the breeze like a faint echo. Other times it was so close, it felt as though the speaker was running beside her. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape it. Her legs burned, her chest heaved, but she didn't dare slow down. She just had to make it back to the parking lot. That was all. Once she was out of the woods, everything would be fine. That was what she told herself, over and over, as the trail stretched endlessly before her. But as she rounded another bend, she stumbled to a stop. The trail ahead was blocked. A figure stood in the middle of the path, shrouded in shadow. Its features were indistinct, blurred by the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. But Sarah didn't need to see its face to know it wasn't human. The way it stood unnaturally still, unnervingly rigid, set every nerve in her body on edge. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't from the woods. It came from the figure. Sarah, her name, spoken in that same intimate, familiar tone. Her knees buckled, and she gripped a nearby tree for support. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her, waiting, summoning every ounce of courage she had. Sarah forced herself to speak. "What do you want?" she demanded, though her voice was little more than a broken whisper. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed to the bushes on her left. Sarah's stomach churned. She didn't want to look, she couldn't, but her body betrayed her. Her head turned, her eyes drawn to the spot like a moth to a flame. The bushes rustled, and a pale hand emerged from the foliage. Sarah screamed. Sarah's scream echoed through the forest, swallowed quickly by the suffocating silence that followed. Her legs trembled, threatening to give way, but she forced herself to stay upright. The pale hand emerging from the bushes sent a cold wave of terror through her, and for a moment, she was frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The hand didn't move. It just lay there, pale and lifeless, as though whoever or whatever it belonged to had simply abandoned it. The figure in the trail remained still as well, its shadowy form unmoving, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, piercing through her like needles. The whisper came again, low and insistent. Sarah, her name curled through the air like smoke, wrapping around her and sending a chill down her spine. It was louder now, closer, as though it were being spoken directly into her ear. She whipped her head around, but no one was there. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking. She didn't know who she was yelling at, maybe the figure, maybe the voice, maybe the forest itself. Her own words sounded pitiful, drowned out by the thudding of her heartbeat in her ears. Gathering her courage, Sarah edged closer to the bushes where the hand had appeared. She moved slowly, her body tense, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. The whispering didn't stop. It grew louder with every step she took, layering over itself like a sinister chant. Sarah, Sarah. She reached the edge of the bushes and hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to push the branches aside, her mind screaming at her to turn and run. But she had to know. She had to see. She parted the bushes and found nothing. The hand was gone. The undergrowth was undisturbed, as though nothing had ever been there. Sarah stumbled back, her chest heaving. The whispers swirled around her now, relentless and inescapable. Sarah, Sarah. They were everywhere, coming from every direction, yet still carrying that unsettling intimacy. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. It was inside her head, burrowing into her mind like a parasite. "Who are you?" she cried, her voice raw with desperation. "What do you want from me?" The whispering stopped. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the forest was silent again. Sarah lowered her hands slowly, her ears ringing in the sudden quiet. She turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning the trail and the surrounding trees. The figure was gone, and the woods were still once more. Maybe it's over, she thought, though she didn't believe it. Her body was tense, every nerve screaming that she wasn't alone. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and far too close. They didn't match her own, they followed a different rhythm. A slow, purposeful cadence that sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through her. She spun around, her eyes darting to the source of the sound. No one was there. The footsteps grew louder, circling her, crunching against the gravel of the trail and the dry leaves of the forest floor. They moved in a deliberate pattern, weaving closer and closer with each pass. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. Sarah's breath hitched as she waited, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. The forest was silent again, but the air felt heavier now, charged with an oppressive energy that pressed down on her chest. She took a shaky step forward, her legs like jelly. And then, from directly behind her, the whisper came again. "Sarah." She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. There was nothing there, just empty air and the endless shadows of the forest. But the voice had been so close, so real, that she could feel the warmth of breath against the back of her neck. Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled backward, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. She had to get out. Without another thought, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the trail as the whispers rose to a fever pitch. "Sarah, Sarah." They followed her, growing louder and more frantic with every step. The voices overlapped, becoming a cacophony that drowned out her own thoughts. She clutched at her head, her vision blurring as panic consumed her. The trail ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in around her like prison bars. The sunlight filtering through the canopy dimmed, as though the forest itself were trying to trap her in darkness. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her, whatever it was. The whispers became words now, phrases she couldn't quite make sense of, layered and jumbled like a broken record. But one sentence stood out, clear and sharp amidst the chaos. "Don't look back." The words sent a jolt of terror through her, and for a moment, she stumbled, nearly falling to her knees. She didn't dare look over her shoulder. She didn't want to see what was following her. "Don't look back." The voice was louder now, more commanding, yet still carried that eerie familiarity. It felt like a warning, but from who or what? The trail blurred before her eyes as tears streamed down her face. Finally, she saw the faint outline of the parking lot ahead. Relief surged through her, giving her the strength for one last sprint. The whispers were deafening now, the footsteps so close she swore she could feel the vibrations through the ground. But she didn't look back. Not until she reached her car, her fingers fumbling with the keys as she threw herself inside and slammed the door. She locked it, her chest heaving as she stared at the empty trail behind her. The forest was still, silent, peaceful, but Sarah knew better. She could still hear the faintest whisper, carried on the wind as she sped away. Sarah didn't stop driving until she was well into the city. her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The familiar hum of civilization slowly enveloped her. Honking cars, pedestrians crossing streets, the distant buzz of construction equipment. It was the kind of noise she'd usually found overwhelming after her peaceful morning runs, but now it was a lifeline, grounding her in the real world. The whispers had stopped. She pulled into the parking lot of a bustling coffee shop, the chatter of patrons spilling out through the open door. Shaking, Sarah killed the engine and sat in silence, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and wide with fear. For a moment, she just sat there, trying to convince herself that she was safe. The trail was miles away now, hidden behind the thick woods on the outskirts of town. Whatever had followed her, if it had followed her, was gone. It's over, she thought, though the words felt hollow. Gathering her courage, she stepped out of the car and joined the throng of people heading into the coffee shop. The warmth of the room embraced her immediately, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the murmur of conversations. She ordered a drink, her hands trembling as she handed over her card, and found a seat near the window. Outside, the world moved on as if nothing had happened. People laughed, cars honked, and the sun shone brightly overhead. It all felt so normal, so completely at odds with the nightmare she'd just escaped. She sipped her coffee, the heat soothing her frayed nerves, but the unease lingered. Every now and then, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. The next day, Sarah stayed home. Her running shoes sat untouched by the door, the laces still tied from her last run. She couldn't bring herself to look at them for too long. Just the thought of stepping onto a trail, any trail, made her stomach churn. Mark noticed her unease and asked if everything was okay. She wanted to tell him, to spill the whole story, but every time she opened her mouth, the words caught in her throat. How could she explain what had happened without sounding crazy? How could she describe the whispers, the shadow, the hand in the bushes, without doubting her own sanity? "I'm just tired," she finally said, forcing a weak smile. "Probably pushed myself too hard yesterday." Mark nodded, unconvinced but willing to let it go. "Maybe take a break for a few days. You deserve it." Sarah agreed, but in her heart, she knew she wouldn't be going back. Not to that trail. Not ever. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal. Sarah threw herself into work, filling her days with deadlines and meetings, avoiding the quiet hours when her mind might wander back to the trail. She started running again, but only at the gym, where the hum of treadmills and the chatter of other gym-goers drowned out the echoes of her fear. She never spoke of what happened, not to Mark, not to anyone. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened, to convince herself that it was all a bad dream. But no matter how hard she tried, the memory lingered, surfacing in the quiet moments before sleep or in the rustle of leaves outside her window. She avoided the outskirts of town altogether. The thought of driving past the trailhead made her palms sweat, her chest tighten. She didn't need to go back to know that the whispers were still there, waiting for her. One night, as she lay in bed, the memory of the voice came rushing back, soft, intimate, and unsettlingly familiar. Sarah. It was the way the voice had spoken her name that haunted her most. Not with malice, but with an almost gentle persistence, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Her heart raced as she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of that morning in agonizing detail. The shadowy figure, the pale hand, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She was safe now. The whispers were gone. They couldn't follow her here. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Months later, Sarah found herself driving along the edge of town on an errand, her route taking her perilously close to the woods. Her hands gripped the wheel tighter as she approached the turnoff to the trail. She told herself not to look, but her eyes betrayed her, flicking toward the familiar gravel path as she passed. The entrance was overgrown now, the weeds and brambles reclaiming the space. No one had been there in a long time, it seemed. Yet, as she sped past, she swore she saw movement, a shadow shifting among the trees. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she forced her eyes back to the road, her chest tight with panic. It was just her imagination, she told herself. Just her mind playing tricks on her. But later that night, as she lay in the safety of her bed, she thought she heard it again. A whisper, soft, faint, and impossibly close. Sarah. She sat bolt upright, her chest heaving, her eyes scanning the darkened room. The house was silent. The street outside was quiet. There was nothing there, but the feeling remained. The heavy, oppressive sensation of being watched. Sarah never returned to the trail. She never spoke of what happened, and eventually, the whispers faded into the background of her memory, an unanswered question she tried not to think about. But every now and then, in the stillness of the night, she thought she could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the soft crunch of footsteps, and her name, carried on the wind like a ghost's breath. Sarah. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the dense forest as the sound of crunching leaves and laughter filled the air. A group of 4 friends, Megan, Ryan, Lily, and James, hiked along the narrow trail, their backpacks stuffed with camping gear and snacks. They had been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of city life and immerse themselves in the solitude of nature. "This is going to be epic," Ryan said, his voice brimming with enthusiasm as he adjusted the straps on his pack. "No phones, no work, just us and the great outdoors." "Don't forget the bears," Lily quipped, smirking as she trailed behind him. "Or the mountain lions." "Lily, stop," Megan groaned, swatting her friend playfully. "You'll scare James." "I'm fine," James muttered, though his eyes darted nervously to the shadows between the trees. "I just think it's weird how quiet it is out here." He wasn't wrong. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more the usual sounds of nature seemed to fade away. No birdsong, no rustling squirrels, just the faint whisper of the wind through the trees and the steady crunch of their boots on the path. But none of them paid much attention. After all, they'd chosen this spot for its remoteness. The forest was beautiful in its solitude. Towering pines reached skyward, their needles creating a soft, fragrant carpet beneath the group's feet. Beams of sunlight pierced through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. It was the kind of untouched wilderness that felt like stepping into another world. "All right, this looks like a good spot," Ryan announced as they emerged into a small clearing. The area was surrounded by trees on all sides, providing a sense of privacy and security. A shallow stream meandered nearby, its crystal-clear water sparkling in the waning light. "Perfect," Megan agreed, dropping her pack with a relieved sigh. "Let's set up camp before it gets dark." The group quickly got to work. Megan and Lily pitched the tent, their practiced teamwork evident in the ease with which they handled the task. Ryan gathered firewood, occasionally tossing playful jabs at James, who struggled with the finicky camping stove. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the campsite was fully set up. A roaring campfire crackled at the center of the clearing, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The group sat around it, toasting marshmallows and sharing stories as the sky darkened into a deep navy, sprinkled with stars. "This was a great idea," Megan said, her face glowing in the firelight as she leaned back against her pack. "I can't remember the last time I felt this relaxed." "Same," Lily agreed, poking her marshmallow with a stick, "though I could do without James burning half the snacks." James rolled his eyes, popping a charred marshmallow into his mouth. "You're welcome to do it yourself, you know." The group laughed, the sound echoing into the quiet night. For a while, everything felt perfect, peaceful, but as the hours passed and the fire burned lower, the atmosphere began to change. It started subtly, so subtle that no one noticed at first. A faint hum, like the distant buzz of an electrical current, carried on the night air. Megan was the first to pick up on it, her brow furrowing as she paused mid-sentence. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. "Hear what?" Ryan replied, tossing another log onto the fire. "That humming sound. It's faint, but I don't know, it's weird." The group fell silent, straining their ears. The hum was barely audible, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a steady, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Probably just the wind," Ryan said dismissively, though his grin had faded. Lily tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "It doesn't sound like wind. It's too mechanical." James shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the darkened forest. "Maybe it's a plane? Or, like, some kind of equipment? In the middle of nowhere?" Lily shot back, raising an eyebrow. "Not likely." Megan's gaze drifted toward the trees. The forest was pitch black now, the campfire's glow unable to penetrate the dense shadows. The hum persisted, low and steady, like the heartbeat of the woods themselves. "Let's just forget it," Ryan said, forcing a laugh. "We came here to relax, not freak ourselves out over nothing." The others murmured in agreement, though none of them looked entirely convinced. They returned to their conversation, their laughter quieter now, more subdued. But Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later that night, as the group settled into the tent, the hum grew louder. Megan lay awake, staring at the nylon ceiling above her as the sound pulsed in her ears. It wasn't just louder, it was closer. It seemed to reverberate through the ground, vibrating the very air around her. She turned her head to see if the others were still awake, but Ryan and James were snoring softly, and Lily was curled up in her sleeping bag, her face peaceful. The hum shifted, rising and falling in pitch, like a song without melody. Megan sat up, her heart pounding. Something was out there. She was sure of it. Grabbing her flashlight, she unzipped the tent as quietly as she could and stepped into the cool night air. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the clearing in a dim, reddish glow. The forest beyond was an impenetrable wall of darkness. And then she saw it, a light, faint and flickering, deep within the trees. It wasn't the warm orange of a campfire or the harsh white of a flashlight. It was something else entirely soft and pale, like moonlight reflected on water. It moved slowly, almost hypnotically, weaving through the forest like it had a will of its own. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to call out to the others, to wake them, but the words wouldn't come. She felt rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the strange, otherworldly glow. The hum grew louder, matching the rhythm of the light as it pulsed and shifted. Megan's skin prickled with goosebumps. She took a hesitant step forward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The light seemed to beckon her, drawing her deeper into the forest. Megan's breathing was shallow as she stood frozen at the edge of the campsite, her eyes locked on the pale, flickering light deep within the forest. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like it was alive, swaying gently as though caught in an unseen breeze. The hum that accompanied it grew louder, resonating in her chest like a low, unrelenting vibration. Behind her, the soft rustle of fabric made her jump. She spun around to see Ryan stepping out of the tent, his hair disheveled and his eyes half-lidded with sleep. "What are you doing out here?" he asked groggily, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. Megan hesitated, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "There's something in the woods," she whispered, gesturing toward the trees. "A light. It's moving." Ryan frowned, stepping closer to peer into the darkness. "A light? Like a fire?" "No, it's different. It's weird. Just look." He followed her gaze, his expression skeptical. But as the light flickered again, his posture stiffened. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice now tinged with unease. The light shifted suddenly, darting higher into the trees as though it had noticed them. It hovered for a moment, suspended among the branches, before beginning to move again. Faster this time, weaving through the canopy with an almost deliberate grace. "It's not natural," Megan said, her voice trembling. "It's like it's watching us." Ryan didn't respond. He was already walking back to the tent, shaking James and Lily awake. Within moments, the group was gathered outside, their sleepy faces now alert and filled with apprehension as they stared into the forest. "Maybe it's a drone," James suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "Someone messing with us. In the middle of nowhere?" Lily shot back, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "I don't think so." The hum intensified, and the light darted closer, flitting from one treetop to the next. It didn't behave like a drone or anything else they'd ever seen. It was too erratic, too deliberate, moving in a way that defied logic. There was no sound accompanying it. No whir of propellers, no rustling of branches. Just the persistent, otherworldly hum. "We should leave," Megan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This doesn't feel right." Ryan hesitated, glancing toward the trail they'd hiked in on. "It's the middle of the night," he said. "Do you really want to stumble through the woods in the dark?" "Better than staying here," Lily snapped, her voice shaking. "What if it comes closer?" As if in response, the light stopped moving. It hovered directly above them now, high in the canopy, its glow illuminating the clearing in a pale, ghostly light. The hum was deafening, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. James took a step back, his face pale. "Okay, yeah, we're leaving. Right now." The group scrambled to pack their essentials, their movements frantic and clumsy in the dim light of their flashlights. The air was thick with tension, each of them acutely aware of the light's unwavering presence above them. It didn't move, but they could feel it. Watching, waiting. They left the campsite in a rush, their packs slung haphazardly over their shoulders. The trail back to their car was narrow and uneven, twisting through dense undergrowth and gnarled roots. The hum followed them, faint at first but growing louder with each passing minute. "Is it following us?" Lily asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of their hurried footsteps. Megan glanced upward, her heart sinking. The light was still there, weaving through the treetops like a predator stalking its prey. It darted ahead of them now, moving with an unsettling speed and precision, as if it knew where they were going. "It's cutting us off," Megan said, panic rising in her chest. "It's not letting us leave." "That's ridiculous," Ryan shot back, though his voice quivered. "It's just a light. It can't." A sudden burst of brightness cut him off. The light descended rapidly, streaking through the trees like a comet and stopping just ahead of them on the trail. It hovered there, pulsing and flickering as if daring them to come closer. The group froze. No one spoke, their breaths coming in shallow gasps as they stared at the glowing orb. It was larger now, its pale light casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. The hum was deafening, resonating in their skulls and making it impossible to think. "What do we do?" James whispered, his voice trembling. "We go around," Ryan said firmly, though the fear in his eyes betrayed his confidence. "We're not turning back." Megan hesitated, her gaze locked on the light. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was alive, that it was aware of them in a way that sent chills down her spine. But there was no other choice. They couldn't stay here, not with the hum growing louder and the light's presence so oppressive. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible, "but stay together. Don't split up." They moved cautiously, stepping off the trail and into the undergrowth to skirt around the light. The branches clawed at their clothes, and the uneven ground made their progress slow and treacherous. All the while, the light remained where it was, pulsing steadily, its glow casting the forest in an unnatural, alien hue. But as they circled back toward the trail, the hum shifted. It grew deeper, more resonant, vibrating through their very cores. Megan glanced back and froze. The light was moving again, this time toward them. "Run!" she screamed, her voice piercing the oppressive hum. The group broke into a sprint, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate attempt to escape. The light followed, its glow growing brighter, its movements faster. It weaved through the trees with an unnatural grace, never faltering, never slowing. Megan's lungs burned, and her legs ached, but she didn't dare stop. The hum was everywhere now, pressing against her ears and making her head throb. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw it closer than ever, its glow almost blinding. "Faster!" Ryan shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. But the light was relentless, closing in with every passing second. The group stumbled to a stop in a small clearing, their breaths ragged and chests heaving. The hum was quieter now, as if the strange light had retreated. But the oppressive feeling of being watched hung heavy in the air, making it difficult to breathe. "Where did it go?" Lily asked, her voice a whisper as she scanned the darkness around them. Her flashlight wavered in her trembling hand, its beam barely piercing the shadows. "It's gone," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. He turned in a slow circle, his flashlight sweeping the surrounding trees. "It just disappeared." "Things like that don't just disappear," Megan snapped, her voice sharper than intended. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made her jittery, her senses on high alert. She couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that the light hadn't left, but was simply biding its time. "What if it's trying to scare us?" James suggested, his voice shaky. "Like, testing us or something? Testing us for what?" Ryan shot back, his frustration bubbling over. "It's just a stupid light. We're freaking ourselves out over nothing. It's not just a light." Megan snapped, her voice rising. "You saw it move. You felt the hum. That thing is alive." "Guys, stop." Lily interrupted, her tone panicked. She pointed toward the edge of the clearing, her flashlight beam trembling. "What's that?" The others followed her gaze. At first, it seemed like nothing, just more trees and shadows. But then, faintly, the light appeared again. This time, it was smaller, dimmer, almost as if it were hiding. It hovered just beyond the tree line, flickering softly like a dying ember. Ryan clenched his jaw. "I've had enough of this." Before anyone could stop him, he raised his flashlight and aimed it directly at the light. The powerful beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the strange orb in sharp relief. But instead of reacting like an ordinary object, the light shimmered, almost dissolving under the harsh glare. It pulsed once, violently, then vanished entirely. The forest plunged into silence. The hum stopped, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their relief tempered by the oppressive feeling that something wasn't right. "Did we scare it off?" James asked hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think so," Megan replied, her eyes scanning the trees. The quiet was too heavy, too deliberate, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "It's still here. I can feel it." Ryan exhaled sharply. "Great. So now we're scared of nothing. Let's just keep moving and get out of here." But as they turned to leave the clearing, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was no longer a vague unease, it was tangible, almost physical, like invisible eyes boring into their backs. Megan's skin prickled, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Does anyone else feel that?" Lily asked, her voice quivering. "Feel what?" Ryan replied, though his grip on his flashlight tightened. "Like we're not alone," Lily said, her eyes darting around the clearing. "Like something's watching us." James swallowed hard, his own flashlight beam flickering as his hand trembled. "Yeah, I feel it too." Megan nodded. "It's close. I don't know where, but it's close." The group huddled together, their flashlights sweeping the forest as they tried to pinpoint the source of their unease. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches casting jagged shadows on the forest floor. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, made their hearts race. And then they saw it. The light reappeared, but this time it was different. It didn't hover in the distance or dart through the trees. It floated just beyond the edge of the clearing, motionless and silent. It was larger now, its pale glow casting long, eerie shadows that stretched toward the group like grasping fingers. "It's back," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Ryan raised his flashlight again, his jaw set. "Maybe we can drive it off for good this time." "Wait," Megan hissed, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what it is. We don't know what it wants." "Exactly," Ryan replied, pulling free. "And I'm not sticking around to find out." He pointed his flashlight directly at the light and turned it on, the powerful beam cutting through the darkness. The light reacted instantly, flaring brightly before flickering erratically. It pulsed once, twice, then vanished again, leaving the clearing in pitch-black silence. But the hum returned. This time, it was different, deeper, more resonant, as if the forest itself were vibrating. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, and the oppressive sense of being watched grew unbearable. Megan's chest tightened, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "It's angry," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "Whatever we did, it's angry." "We need to move," Megan said, her voice firm despite her fear. "Now." The group turned and ran, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they tore through the forest. The hum followed them, growing louder with every step. It was everywhere above them, below them, all around them, and though the light didn't reappear, the feeling of its presence was suffocating. Megan's mind raced as she ran, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion. What was the light? Why was it following them? And, most terrifying of all, what would happen if it caught them? The trail stretched endlessly before them, the exit to the forest still miles away. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. The hum was relentless, and the feeling of invisible eyes watching their every move refused to let them go. The first rays of dawn broke through the canopy, bathing the forest in a muted golden light. The oppressive darkness of the night was gone, but the unease remained, clinging to the group like a shadow. None of them had slept. They'd spent the rest of the night huddled together in the tent, too afraid to move, their flashlights clutched tightly in their hands. The hum had eventually faded, but the sense of being watched never truly left. Even now, as they packed up their campsite in silence, the memory of the light and its unrelenting presence weighed heavily on them. "We need to get out of here," Megan said, her voice hoarse. She stuffed her belongings into her backpack with trembling hands, barely caring if things were properly secured. "Now." "Agreed," Ryan muttered, his usual bravado replaced by a grim determination. He slung his pack over his shoulder and glanced toward the trail. "The sooner we're gone, the better." Lily nodded, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't spoken much since the light's last appearance, her usual sharp wit dulled by fear. James, too, was unusually quiet, his hands shaking as he struggled to zip up his pack. As they made their way back to the trailhead, the forest seemed different. The early morning light illuminated every detail, the gnarled roots snaking across the path, the moss clinging to tree trunks, the way the dew glistened on the leaves. But instead of feeling comforting, the brightness only highlighted how alien the woods felt now, as though the forest itself was watching them leave. The trail was eerily silent, the usual sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves conspicuously absent. Even the soft crunch of their boots on the dirt path felt muted, swallowed by the stillness. No one spoke as they walked, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they finally reached the parking lot, relief swept over them like a wave. Their car sat undisturbed, a beacon of normalcy in the otherwise surreal landscape. They piled in quickly, their movements hurried and frantic, as though staying any longer might invite the light back. Ryan started the engine, the familiar rumble breaking the heavy silence. "Let's never do this again," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "No arguments here," Lily said, leaning her head against the window. Her voice was shaky, but there was a hint of her usual sarcasm. "Next time, let's camp somewhere with Wi-Fi and a hotel within walking distance." James forced a weak chuckle, though it quickly dissolved into a nervous glance out the rear window. "Do you think it's still following us?" "It's over," Ryan said firmly, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his uncertainty. "We're out of the woods. Whatever it was, it's staying there." Megan wasn't so sure. She sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the forest as they pulled onto the main road. The trees loomed in the rearview mirror, their shadows stretching across the dirt lot. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a faint flicker of light between the branches. But when she blinked, it was gone. "Let's just go," she whispered, turning her gaze forward. "I don't want to think about it anymore." The drive back to town was tense but uneventful. The familiar sights of gas stations, roadside diners, and convenience stores brought some measure of comfort, though the unease lingered. By the time they reached Megan's apartment, the sun was fully up, casting everything in a warm, reassuring glow. "You sure you're okay?" Ryan asked as Megan climbed out of the car. She nodded, though her grip on her backpack strap tightened. "I'll be fine. I just need some time." "Yeah," he said, his voice soft. "We all do." Lily and James offered weak smiles and goodbyes before the car pulled away, leaving Megan standing on the sidewalk. She watched them go, her mind replaying the events of the night over and over. Over the next few weeks, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. The group rarely spoke of the camping trip, each of them eager to put the experience behind them. Megan tried to focus on work, filling her days with meetings and deadlines, but the memory of the light lingered, surfacing in the quiet moments before sleep. She stopped hiking altogether, the thought of stepping back into the woods filling her with dread. Even passing by the edge of town, where the forest loomed in the distance, made her stomach churn. She couldn't shake the feeling that the light was still out there, waiting, watching. One night, as she sat alone in her apartment, Megan found herself scrolling through an online forum for unexplained phenomena. She typed in a description of the light, hesitating for a moment before hitting post. The replies came quickly, some dismissive, others curious, but none offering any real answers. But one reply stood out. "You're not alone," it read. "I saw it too. Stay away from the woods." Her blood ran cold as she stared at the message, her mind racing. She didn't reply, didn't want to know more. Instead, she closed her laptop and turned off the lights, hoping sleep would take her quickly. But as she lay in the dark, the memory of the hum returned, faint and distant, like a song she couldn't quite place. And for the briefest moment, she thought she saw it again, a flicker of light outside her window, soft and pale, before it vanished into the night. She never went back to the forest. None of them did. The old house groaned softly in the afternoon breeze as Claire adjusted her ladder, her eyes fixed on the peeling paint of the ceiling above her. She had bought the place for a steal, an aging Victorian nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. It was her dream project, a chance to transform something neglected into a cozy, welcoming home. The house was full of quirks: creaking floorboards, ornate but crumbling crown molding, and stained glass windows that caught the light just right. Claire loved every imperfect inch of it. But today, as she worked on patching a crack in the plaster ceiling, something caught her eye. At first, she thought it was just a shadow, a faint outline against the dull white surface. But as she tilted her head, the outline became clearer, more defined. A small, square door, its edges warped and uneven, was embedded in the ceiling above her. Dust clung to its surface, and faint cobwebs trailed from its corners. Frowning, Claire climbed higher on the ladder to get a closer look. She'd spent weeks familiarizing herself with the layout of the house, poring over blueprints and inspection reports. This door wasn't in any of them. It wasn't in the description provided by the realtor, either. In fact, it seemed like no one had ever mentioned it before. "What the hell?" she muttered, reaching out to brush away the cobwebs. The wood felt rough and brittle under her fingertips, and as she pressed gently, the door didn't budge. There was no handle, no hinges visible on this side, just the faint outline of a forgotten passageway. The discovery unsettled her, but she quickly shook it off. Old houses were full of surprises, after all. Hidden closets, strange crawl spaces. It wasn't unusual to stumble across something unexpected in a place like this. Still, she couldn't help the nagging curiosity that tugged at the back of her mind. Grabbing her phone, Claire snapped a few photos of the door before climbing down the ladder. She opened her laptop and pulled up the digital blueprints of the house, scrolling through them with furrowed brows. The floor above this room was supposed to be empty, just an attic, mostly filled with insulation and old beams. There was no mention of an access point like this one. She glanced back up at the ceiling. The door seemed to stare back at her, almost daring her to investigate. That evening, as the sun set and shadows stretched across the room, Claire found herself staring at the door again. She tried to focus on her renovation plans, measurements for the new kitchen counters, paint swatches for the living room, but her eyes kept drifting upward. The quiet hum of the house felt heavier now, the usual creaks and groans somehow more pronounced. By the time she went to bed, the door had lodged itself firmly in her mind. She tossed and turned, her imagination running wild with possibilities. What was up there? Storage? A forgotten part of the house's history? Or something else entirely? The next morning, Claire decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a flathead screwdriver, she climbed the ladder once more. The light from the window caught the dust motes in the air as she pressed the edge of the screwdriver into the seam of the door. The wood groaned under the pressure, splintering slightly as she pried it open. A puff of stale, cold air escaped, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Claire recoiled instinctively, but her curiosity overpowered her hesitation. She adjusted her flashlight, aiming it into the dark void above. At first, she saw nothing but cobwebs and beams, but as her eyes adjusted, the narrow beam of light revealed something glinting faintly in the shadows. A chain, dangling from the ceiling above the small door, swayed gently, as though it had been recently disturbed. Her breath caught in her throat. What the hell is this? Carefully, she hoisted herself higher, her head just barely breaching the opening. The space beyond was cramped, dusty, and strange. The chain she'd seen was attached to a small trapdoor set into the attic's roof, leading, she assumed, to the outside. But that wasn't what caught her attention. Lying on the floor of the crawl space, half buried in dust and debris, was a small wooden box. Claire hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave it alone. But curiosity won out. She stretched her arm through the opening, her fingers brushing against the box's rough surface. It was lighter than she expected, and as she pulled it closer, the faint rattle of something inside sent a chill down her spine. The box was simple plain wood, no markings or engravings. It was bound with a thin strip of leather, brittle and cracked with age. Claire climbed back down the ladder, her hands trembling slightly as she set the box on the floor. She stared at it for a long moment before untying the leather strap. The lid creaked open, revealing its contents: a stack of faded photographs and a small, tarnished key. The photos were black and white, their edges curled with age. They depicted a family, parents, 2 children, standing in front of the very house Claire now called home. Their faces were solemn, their eyes unnervingly blank. In the last photo, the family stood in the same pose, but one of the children was missing. Claire's stomach churned as she set the photos aside and picked up the key. It was small, made of iron, and cold to the touch. As she turned it over in her hand, a faint, rhythmic sound filled the room. Tap, tap, tap. Her blood ran cold. The sound was coming from above, just beyond the small door in the ceiling. Claire stood at the base of the ladder, staring up at the open door in the ceiling. The rhythmic tapping had stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving the house in an unsettling silence. Her flashlight rested in her hand, its beam shaking slightly as she hesitated. "It's just an old house," she whispered to herself, though her voice sounded hollow. Nothing unusual. With a deep breath, she climbed the ladder again. The air grew colder as she approached the opening, carrying a faint metallic tang that set her nerves on edge. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty void beyond the door. It was just as she'd seen before, beams crisscrossing under the roof, patches of insulation spilling from the walls, and cobwebs draped like curtains. The space should have felt unremarkable, just another forgotten part of the house. But there was something wrong. The air felt heavy, thick, as if it were pressing down on her. It smelled stale, tinged with dampness and something faintly sour, like rot. She hoisted herself up, balancing precariously as she peered deeper into the space. Dust swirled in the flashlight's beam, and the silence felt alive, vibrating against her eardrums. As she scanned the area, she realized that the walls of the crawl space didn't match the dimensions of the house. They seemed to extend farther than they should, vanishing into the shadows beyond the reach of her light. "That's not possible," she muttered. Her voice echoed faintly, as though the crawl space were larger than it appeared. The feeling of being watched hit her suddenly, a prickling sensation that started at the back of her neck and radiated down her spine. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The crawl space was empty, she could see that much, but the sensation was undeniable. It was as if something unseen lingered just beyond the edges of her flashlight's beam, its gaze heavy and unyielding. Claire turned the light toward the far corner of the space, her breath hitching. For a split second, she thought she saw movement, a faint ripple in the darkness, like a shadow detaching itself from the wall. She blinked, and it was gone, leaving her doubting her own eyes. "Hello," she called out, her voice cracking. The word echoed strangely, bouncing off the walls in a way that didn't seem natural. She waited, her ears straining for any response, but there was only silence. She was about to retreat when her flashlight flickered. The beam dimmed and brightened erratically, casting the crawl space in uneven shadows. Claire smacked the flashlight against her palm, her pulse quickening as the light sputtered. For a brief moment, it went out entirely, plunging her into darkness. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible exhale. It was close, too close, like someone or something was standing right behind her. Claire spun around, her flashlight flaring back to life. The crawl space was empty. The sensation of being watched remained, stronger than ever, but there was nothing there. Her breaths came in short, panicked bursts as she scrambled toward the opening, desperate to get out of the suffocating space. Her foot slipped on the edge of the ladder, and she barely managed to catch herself. Clutching the sides of the opening, she lowered herself back into the room below, her heart pounding. The house felt different now, the once cozy space heavy with an oppressive presence. She looked up at the door, still open above her. For a moment, she considered slamming it shut and forgetting it ever existed. But the images from the box lingered in her mind, the solemn faces of the family, the missing child, and the key that now rested in her pocket. Something about the space felt unfinished, as though it demanded her attention. As she stood there, a faint creak sounded from above, like the shift of weight on old beams. Claire's skin prickled. The sensation of being watched returned, stronger and more focused, as if the presence in the crawl space had moved closer. She backed away from the ladder, her flashlight aimed at the opening. The beam caught the edge of the trapdoor, highlighting the splintered wood and the faint smudges of dirt around its edges. Her mind raced with possibilities: animals, structural damage, tricks of the light, but none of them felt convincing. The tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. It was slower this time, deliberate and closer than before. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears as she realized it wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from the walls. Claire had sealed the trapdoor shut the day she discovered the tapping. She dragged an old wooden chest from the attic to weigh it down, convinced that would be the end of it. But that night, the sounds began again. It started as a faint tapping, barely audible over the hum of her heater. Claire had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with images of the crawl space. The sound was soft, rhythmic, and impossible to ignore. Tap, tap, tap. She told herself it was the house settling. Old wood creaked, pipes rattled, normal, explainable things. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that. The sound came from the ceiling, directly above her room, right where the mysterious door was hidden. Claire pulled the covers tighter around her, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to focus on the soothing rhythm of her breathing, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making it wanted her attention. "Stop it," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who or what she was speaking to. The tapping stopped. She exhaled shakily, relief washing over her. But just as she began to relax, a new sound emerged, a faint scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood. It moved slowly, deliberately, tracing a path from one end of the ceiling to the other. Claire's body stiffened, every muscle frozen in place as the sound grew closer, stopping directly above her bed. Her breath hitched as the tapping resumed, louder now. It was no longer a polite knock, it was demanding, insistent, like a clenched fist pounding against the wood. Claire didn't sleep that night. The following day, she tried to convince herself that it was all in her head. Exhaustion could play tricks on the mind, especially in an old house with creaky boards and drafts. She buried herself in renovation projects, hoping to distract herself from the growing unease that gnawed at her. But the feeling of being watched never left. It followed her from room to room, an invisible weight pressing on her shoulders. She felt it most acutely near the trapdoor, as though something on the other side was waiting for her, watching her every move. That night, the noises returned. Tap, tap, tap. Claire sat up in bed, her heart racing as she stared at the ceiling. She hadn't turned off the lights this time, unable to bear the oppressive darkness. The trapdoor was directly above her now, separated only by a thin layer of plaster and wood. "Go away," she said aloud, her voice trembling. You're not welcome here." The tapping stopped. For a moment, the house was silent. Then, without warning, a loud bang reverberated through the ceiling, shaking the walls and sending a cloud of dust raining down. Claire screamed, scrambling out of bed as the sound echoed in her ears. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, its harsh beam cutting through the dim room. The ceiling was intact, but the sound had been so loud, so visceral, that she couldn't shake the image of something or someone trying to break through. She dialed Ryan, her closest friend, her fingers shaking as she held the phone to her ear. "Claire? It's late, what's going on?" Ryan's groggy voice did little to ease her panic. "There's something in my house," she whispered, glancing nervously at the ceiling. "In the crawlspace. It's making noises, like it's trying to get out." There was a long pause. "You've been working too hard," Ryan said finally. "You're probably just hearing the house settling. You know how old places are." "I know what I heard, Ryan," she snapped, her voice cracking. "I'm not imagining this." All right, he said quickly. "Do you want me to come over?" Claire hesitated. The idea of not being alone was appealing, but she wasn't sure what Ryan could do. Still, she nodded, realizing he couldn't see her. "Yes, please." Ryan arrived 20 minutes later, his expression skeptical but concerned. Claire wasted no time leading him to the room beneath the trapdoor, recounting everything that had happened as he followed her. "You're sure it's not an animal?" he asked, shining his own flashlight toward the ceiling. "Raccoons, squirrels, stuff like that gets into old houses all the time." "I checked the crawl space," Claire said, her voice shaking. "It's empty." Ryan didn't look convinced, but he climbed the ladder anyway. He examined the door carefully, running his hands along its edges. "It's sealed pretty tight," he said. "Whatever you're hearing isn't getting through this." As if in response, the tapping started again. Ryan froze, his hands still on the trapdoor. He glanced down at Claire, his face pale. "That's not an animal." The tapping grew louder, faster, until it sounded like a frantic pounding. Claire backed away, her hands pressed against her ears as the sound reverberated through the room. "Ryan, get down," she shouted. But Ryan stayed frozen, his eyes wide as he stared at the door. "There's something up there," he said, his voice barely audible. The pounding stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire lowered her hands slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared up at the ceiling. Ryan climbed down the ladder, his face drawn and pale. "I don't know what's going on," he said quietly, "but you need to get out of this house." Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not staying another night." As they gathered a few essentials, Claire felt it again, that heavy, oppressive presence. She glanced back at the trapdoor one last time, her stomach churning as she noticed something new. The edges of the door were wet, glistening faintly in the light. Something was leaking through. The following morning, Claire was a woman on a mission. After spending the rest of the night wide awake on Ryan's couch, she returned to the house armed with tools, determination, and a deep-seated need to reclaim her sense of control. "This is it," she told herself as she stood beneath the trapdoor, staring up at the warped wood. The edges of the door were still faintly damp, though the liquid had dried into a pale, crusty residue that made her stomach churn. She didn't want to think about what it might be or where it had come from. Ryan was with her, his jaw set as he held the ladder steady. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, his voice low. "We could just call someone, an inspector, maybe. Let them deal with it." Claire shook her head. "This is my house. I need to handle this myself." With a deep breath, she climbed the ladder and began her work. She hammered nails into the edges of the door, sealing it shut as tightly as she could. Each blow echoed through the house, reverberating in her chest like a heartbeat. When she finished with the nails, she applied a thick layer of caulk around the seams, making sure there was no chance of it opening again. As a final measure, she placed a heavy wooden plank across the ceiling, securing it to the surrounding beams with screws. It wasn't elegant, but it was sturdy. Satisfied, she climbed down and wiped her hands on her jeans, her heart pounding. "That should do it," she said, though her voice wavered. Ryan nodded, his expression serious. "If it starts again, any noise, anything, you call me. Okay?" No more handling this alone. Claire managed a weak smile. Deal. For a while, the house was quiet. The tapping stopped. The strange, oppressive hum that had plagued her nights was gone. Even the feeling of being watched seemed to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. Claire threw herself back into her renovation projects, desperate to move on from the unsettling events. But the peace didn't last. It started subtly, a fleeting sensation at the edge of her awareness. The hairs on the back of her neck would stand up as she moved through the house, the air growing colder in certain rooms. Sometimes, she would catch a shadow out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing there. At night, the silence became almost unbearable. She would lie in bed, straining to hear the faintest sound, her mind racing with memories of the trapdoor. Though the noises hadn't returned, the weight of its presence lingered, like a ghost haunting her every move. One evening, as she stood in the kitchen washing dishes, she felt it again, that prickling sensation, as if unseen eyes were boring into her back. She froze, her hands trembling as she slowly turned toward the ceiling. The trapdoor was sealed, hidden beneath the wooden plank. Nothing about it had changed, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, pressing down on her like a physical weight. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not real." The words felt hollow, like a lie she couldn't quite believe. Over time, Claire adapted to the unease, though it never truly went away. She kept the lights on at night, the warm glow a small comfort in the oppressive darkness. She avoided the room beneath the trapdoor whenever she could, using it only for storage and keeping the door firmly closed. Ryan visited often, checking in on her and staying for dinner when he sensed she needed company. But even his presence couldn't dispel the lingering tension that filled the house. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Claire spoke up. "Do you think it's over?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on the screen. Ryan hesitated, his expression thoughtful. "The noises stopped, didn't they?" "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it still feels wrong, like it's still there, waiting." Ryan didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his silence speaking volumes. Months passed, and the house began to take shape. New paint brightened the walls, modern fixtures replaced the rusted old ones, and the hardwood floors gleamed beneath Claire's careful restoration. But no matter how much she transformed the house, the trapdoor remained untouched, a sealed scar in the ceiling that refused to be forgotten. Claire learned to live with the fear, though it never truly left her. Every now and then, she would catch herself glancing at the ceiling, her heart racing as she half expected to hear the tapping again. It never came, but the memory lingered, as vivid as the day she first discovered the door. One night, as she sat alone in her room, her laptop open on her desk, she felt it again. That heavy, unshakable sensation of being watched. Her hands stilled on the keyboard, her breath hitching as the air seemed to grow colder. Slowly, she turned toward the ceiling. The trapdoor was still sealed. The wooden plank remained firmly in place, the caulk and nails holding strong. But as she stared at it, she could have sworn she saw something, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow shifting just beneath the surface. Her blood ran cold, and she turned away quickly, her hands shaking as she shut her laptop and climbed into bed. She pulled the covers tightly around her, her eyes fixed on the far wall as she willed herself to sleep. The house was quiet. The noises hadn't returned, but deep down, Claire knew the truth. It wasn't over, and it never would be.